Hello, everyone. My name is Katherine Cass. I work at Salesforce all the way in San Francisco. So I am 9 hours out of my time zone right now, so please bear with me as I work my way through this presentation. So today I'm going to be talking about release management and how to build up a release management process from scratch. I think the main people who will benefit from this talk are those of you who work on companies are new, and you just push things to production. You don't really have a process behind it. But for those of you at bigger companies, I think that you still might be able to learn a couple things, and at the very least, you'll get a kick out of an embarrassing story I'm going to share. So stay tuned. Before I get to the good stuff, though, I have to do a quick legal note that any purchasing decision should be based on products and services we have available at Salesforce, and nothing beyond that. And so with that said, let's start at the beginning. So my first job was awesome. And I don't think a lot of people can say that. I know from talking to my parents and as I work my way through life, talking to other people, that that's not a common experience. I definitely was lucky with my entry-level job that didn't turn into a horror story. So when I say my first job was awesome, I understand how much privilege I have with saying that. Of course, the company I joined right out of college was Salesforce. I joined a high-functioning team and a great organization there. And it was like amazing from day one. I had moved all the way from Western New York, a smaller rural village, all the way to the middle of a city in California. So even my lifestyle change was completely different starting there. And then when I went into work, I had this killer view of the Bay Area, working with amazing engineers every day to release hundreds of services and operational changes, working with dozens of Scrum teams and just talented people in operations. So the team I was on, Core Release Management, it was a team built of leaders. And those leaders mentored me into becoming the person I am today. They taught me how to lead incidents, how to stay calm under stress, how to even consult with our customers on release management best practices that they were interested in learning for their companies. Most of my day job was just quickly adapting to last-minute complications to keep releases on schedule and our customers happy. And as a release manager, I was empowered to make the last-minute calls and a lot of important stuff, so lots of game day decisions. And outside of that, I was working on a lot of big impact initiatives within the company. So Salesforce has 30,000 employees, lots and lots of products. So how do we make the release process seamless for everyone, everywhere in Salesforce? By the time I had my first promotion, I felt like a release god. Of course, I was young, but I thought I knew everything. I had been coached to success by an amazing team and a kind manager. They were always giving me feedback every day on what I could do better and what I could learn about things to add to my release manager toolkit. But beyond that, I loved my job, and I was good at it too. So after a while, like any good self-respecting millennial, I left. And the decision was made in October, about a year from today, actually. And it was made in one of our company cafes. So I was sitting across from my soon-to-be manager. I was holding a pumpkin spice latte, because that's what the cafes serve in October in San Francisco. And I was listening to him spin tales about this new cool product that he worked on with other engineers on a stack outside of the normal Salesforce stack, with mostly acquired talent from a local startup. And as I sipped my coffee, I was getting more and more excited about this product that was promising to democratize AI. I was listening wide-eyed. I was ready to pounce on that opportunity, and I did. But before I agreed, my soon-to-be manager walked me through what I should expect. The product was called Prediction Builder. It was not generally available yet, which means that paying customers did not yet have access to it. And they still had a couple of wrinkles to iron out before they went GA. He said one of their main things was that they needed someone to own and operate the release process. Lucky for me, I was a release god, so I was ready to accept that opportunity. And I told him, I got you. I can help Einstein platform be the best it can be. And on my end, the logic seemed sound. From my time training as a core release manager, I was equipped with everything I needed to become the release manager for Einstein platform, which was a brand new product. So we finalized everything, and a month later, I showed up for my first week on the job. And I had a very rude awakening. It started with my first release, which was a Wednesday afternoon. I was sitting in a stuffy room in one of our old offices, because that's where the team was working out of at the time. And I was starting off with one of our services that wanted to release a small performance change. So I did what I normally do before we release. I checked all of the lights in production. Everything was green. I turned to the service and I said, "You're good to go." And they looked back at me with a blank look. And they said, "Okay, how?" I had no reaction to that. I sat there. I think I stuttered out by working with your release engineer. But the truth is they didn't have a release engineer, and this was something I was just not used to, because I was used to this highly functional old team I was on with a whole release engineering team to support it, a site reliability engineering team, a customer-centric engineering team. But within this new platform, it was essentially a startup environment. They didn't have that. So we eventually stumbled through the release, lots of the other engineers kind of crowdsourcing knowledge on how to deploy, what parameters to put where, what branch to pull from, and we made it through the day. But this confusion continued to happen over the next few weeks, and as the days went on, any confidence I had that I was a release god was completely gone. It was a new product, which is something that I guess as someone coming from my first job in a really big, good, well-operating team, I just didn't know how to handle. I was woefully unprepared. Because of everything I took for granted in my previous role, I had assumed that a team releasing by virtue, when they showed up in the room to release, that was an agreement that they had tested everything, thoroughly vetted, and documented everything. But the reality was, again, I walked into a startup environment. The product had been built by brilliant data scientists and distributed computing engineers with no real input from any sort of release specialist, which means the path to production at the time was completely random and based on nothing, and it changed all the time. And this was totally okay. Again, we were not customer facing yet, but we still needed to get our stuff together in time to go generally available. So I had to teach myself and the rest of my group how to build a reliable release process from scratch, which again was a different beast for me coming from a healthy, well-functioning organization. So I'm hoping that over the rest of this presentation, I can teach you some things on how to bring your own organization that's trying to get off the ground into a healthy state of a release process. Starting with perhaps the most boring thing, but documentation. And I think this is very important to repeat because a coworker of mine once said that the death of a product comes from information black holes. Without proper documentation, it becomes impossible to reason about how the software works or what it does. So in the short term, it makes it very frustrating to work on the platform. And in the long term, the product can fall over completely because frustrated engineers are going to leave, and with them goes all the information you had about your product. So to prevent this, you can start simple. Enforce that every service have an entry in some sort of service Rolodex. PagerDuty offers a really cool product for this called Service List, but essentially it should contain metadata about every microservice that builds your platform. So you know who to reach out to, where to go for documentation, and perhaps a link to their service overview, which is another thing that's a best practice to encourage all of your service owners to do. So that should talk about the architecture of the platform, what the API structure looks like, testing strategy, things like that. And also definition of done. So again, fairly common process, but bears repeating. Some services need customized versions of definition of done. For example, your machine learning team, if you have one, might have a different approach to testing than your average run-of-the-mill engineering team. So once you have documentation in place, you can move on to the second thing, which is your test and deploy pipeline. Where do you start here? So the importance of this and the importance of complete and automated tests is providing a quick feedback cycle to developers. And it's really worth the time and effort you put into writing these tests. And I encourage you to put them in at 4 specific parts of the release pipeline. There should be a set of tests that run on every new check-in to a branch. That's the basic unit tests, integration tests. You should also run a subset of tests every time you release to a shared environment, like a development environment or staging. Those should be concentrating more around integration tests and the like. And then you should always test before any release to production. And my favorite thing is you should test after you release to production. So things like validation tests and smoke tests. After you're released, you can check manually that your new feature is working, but you should also have some basic, can you log into this other area of the application? Some sort of automated test that runs after you deploy. And as a final note, I do want to talk about regression testing, because in my experience at Salesforce, this is probably the worst kind of test case. If you miss, the customer will be so mad, because the customers are generally more understanding if you're working on a new feature that they're just beginning to use and it's a bit buggy. But if you regress functionality in one of the features they rely on to do their job, they're going to be furious, especially if it was something that stopped working, you fixed, and then it stops working again in the next week. So always add regression tests whenever you're fixing new bugs. On the other end, there's the deploy part of the test and deploy pipeline. So once you have tests in place, you can begin working on this. To begin, I suggest making sure that teams know how to run their own deployments if you don't already have a release engineering team to do that. Second thing, outlaw deployment-related service interruption. So this is important because as your platform grows, it's going to be more and more difficult to fix this. 5-minute service outage while you deploy now seems fine if you have like 10 or 20 customers. When you have 10,000 or 20,000, it's going to be a bit more rough, and your application may have grown to the complexity where it's just way too hard to fix that. So make sure you address that early on. Another thing, if you deploy change, make sure you have the ability to roll back. I've seen a couple situations where services can only fix forward, and that path is very time-consuming and dangerous as your customer base grows too. Another thing, add some sort of automatic logging to your service for test and build failures. Humans are dumb and cannot keep track of everything if there's too much stuff going on. So if you have any sort of automated process, do that for them and send them regular reminders, that's going to help. And finally, CI/CD pipeline. That you can listen to all sorts of talks on that on YouTube or go to a conference just based on it. But if you don't have it in place already, I suggest at least coming up with a plan to get to the point where you are CI/CD. Once you check everything off this list, you will have a reliable deployment pipeline, and that's going to help you begin to scale with the growth of your customers for your platform, and it's going to keep your engineers happy and not leaving your company. So third thing, branching and versioning. As I mentioned earlier, delivering change for a complex product with multiple services becomes a huge time and productivity sink for your engineers, with a special call out to data scientists if you work on an AI product. Normally they're PhDs and they're very good at math and all they want to do is math. They're not really interested in ops. So if you're able to work on a comprehensive, easy to understand branching and versioning pipeline. That's going to make everyone's jobs easier because they can just abstract away how the sausage is made. They can just work on their project and know that it's safely going to eventually get out to production. So where to start? I suggest taking a hard look at your versioning scheme. I've seen really messy, lazy versioning schemes, so if you have a good versioning scheme, good for you. If not, I suggest checking out semantic versioning. The key here is your external customer should be able to differentiate what kinds of release, small release, big release, what's in it, what order to go out in, stuff like that. And once you have that squared away, you can begin thinking about a branching and release best practice to follow. So that's things like you could do trunk-based development if you're wanting to go quickly and you know your tests are good. You could also do Git flow if you want something with a bit more focus on quality. There's lots of options. Just do your research before you stick to one. And keep in mind, depending on the one that you choose, you may have to set up some auto integration for emergency changes going to production. So next week's release branch doesn't go out missing the bug fix that you put into prod the week earlier. And finally, this is obvious but needs to be said sometimes, track where your change is going. Easy litmus test for this, if you look at a commit or a line of code, can any developer tell you what environment it is running in under 60 seconds? If it takes longer than that, it's going to make debugging really difficult during game day incidents. And finally, to wrap up, my favorite subject, which is monitoring and alerting. And it's very important to have more than just a handful of ad hoc monitors and alerts set up for your product. And this is for many reasons. So first off, it lets you know about issues before customers come to you with them. And an additional plus is bug passing. So if you as a service are getting a lot of bugs assigned to you, if you have the right monitoring and alerting set up, you can look at your calls to other services and see where things like delays or errors are coming up from and easily pick that bug up and throw it over to another service without a lot of arguing. And finally, access to some sort of log of how your service was performing at a certain point in time is going to make doing root cause analysis a lot easier. So where do you start here? Comprehensive monitoring should exist and be clearly documented for two cases. One is for your service, and one is for any calls to dependent services from your services. A lot of services I've worked with have mostly concentrated on the first, but again, the second is very important if you want to have an easy way to pass bugs along to the right team. Some things to track I added at the bottom if you don't know too much about what you should be monitoring yet, things like capacity, latency, request rates, and the like. And so all this creates a foundation for my final and most important point of this entire talk, which is that you should have the right things in place that you can support a proper incident management and root cause analysis process when there are service interruptions. So with that said, I want to take some time to talk about the brain a bit. And I'm going to tell you a story about a specific brain that belonged to a war veteran who was damaged in battle, and he was having a lot of seizures. And this was in 1962 when a neurosurgeon reached out to him with a risky procedure that he believed was going to help the war vet. So the war vet agreed, and he sat down. They put him under. The doctor drilled a bunch of holes in his head, and I'm sorry if you're squeamish, but he opened up his head kind of like you open a box. And he reached in with some scissors and snipped a small band of nerves that connected the left side of the brain with the right side of the brain. With the help of his team, they closed the head and stitched it up, and they waited. And after a couple days, the patient fully recovered, and his seizures did stop in intensity. They happened less often. So it didn't 100% solve the issue, but it was a huge increase in his standard of life for this vet. So everything seemed fine and dandy until about a month later when the patient was taken in for cognitive testing. The researchers testing the patient were convinced that there was going to be something weird about his brain since the two sides couldn't talk to each other. And the patient agreed to the test, so the researchers sat him down and they showed him two pictures. So one side of his brain could only see one and the other side could see the other. And the one on the left was a picture of a chicken claw, and the one on the right was just a generic snowy scene. And in front of the patient, he had a bunch of cards he could pick from with images on it. So after he was shown the two pictures, he picked up with his left hand a picture of a chicken, and a right hand he picked up just a snow shovel, which seems good and normal. That's how you should react to this kind of experiment. But the interesting part is when the researchers asked for a reason of why he picked these images. So when they asked, why did you pick this chicken image? He said, well, there was a chicken foot on the screen. They're like, okay. And then they asked, why did you pick the shovel? And the patient said, well, you need a shovel to clean out the chicken coop. He had no ability to verbally communicate that he had seen the snowy scene because the two sides of his brain could not communicate. And the side that saw the chicken was the side that is responsible for verbal communication. So the interesting point of this story is that his brain completely fabricated a story, and he gave his answer to those researchers with the utmost confidence. And I think that's a good way to explain how our brain really comes up with stories, and they can be completely fiction stories to explain things that the brain doesn't understand. So this is really important. When you're setting up a release process for your product, you should have logging, monitoring, alerting. You should have easy to understand processes where when something does happen, you can look back and figure out why your platform acted the way it did in response to some request or there was an error happening in production. It lets you piece together what really happened and get to the root of the issue. So the things we discussed today should save your engineering teams hours of time and frustrated headaches. And hopefully, you'll have less roadblocks to pushing out innovation moving forward. So with that said, I hope you are able to take back some of these learnings to your company and just create a generally happier ecosystem for your developers and for your customers. So thank you. And I want to open it up for questions.